The Eye of Apollo by G.K. Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Eye of Apollo by G.K. Chesterton. That singular smoky sparkle, at once a confusion and a transparency, which is the strange secret of the Thames, was changing more and more from its grey to its glittering extreme as the sun climbed to the zenith over Westminster, and two men crossed Westminster Bridge. One man was very tall, and the other very short. They might even have been fantastically compared to the arrogant clock tower of Parliament and the humbler humped shoulders of the Abbey, for the short man was in clerical dress. The official description of the tall man was M. Hercule Flambeau, private detective, and he was going to his new offices in a new pile of flats facing the Abbey entrance. The official description of the short man was the Reverend J. Brown, attached to St. Francis Xavier's Church, Camberwell, and he was coming from a Camberwell deathbed to see the new offices of his friend. The building was American in its skyscraping altitude, and American also in the oiled elaboration of its machinery of telephones and lifts. But it was barely finished and still understaffed. Only 3 tenants had moved in. The office just above Flambeau was occupied, as also was the office just below him. The 2 floors above that and the 3 floors below were entirely bare. But the first glance at the new tower of flats caught something much more arresting. Save for a few relics of scaffolding, the one glaring object was erected outside the office, just above Flambeau's. It was an enormous gilt effigy of the human eye, surrounded with rays of gold and taking up as much room as 2 or 3 of the office windows. "What on earth is that?" asked Father Brown, and stood still. "Oh, a new religion," said Flambeau, laughing. "One of those new religions that forgive your sins by saying you never had any. Rather like Christian Science, I should think. The fact is that a fellow calling himself Kalon, I don't know what his name is, except that it can't be that, has taken the flat just above me. I have 2 lady typewriters underneath me, and this enthusiastic old humbug on top. He calls himself the new priest of Apollo, and he worships the sun." "Let him look out," said Father Brown. "The sun was the cruelest of all the gods. But what does that monstrous eye mean?" "As I understand it, it is a theory of theirs," answered Flambeau, "that a man can endure anything if his mind is quite steady. Their 2 great symbols are the sun and the open eye, for they say that if a man were really healthy, he could stare at the sun." "If a man were really healthy," said Father Brown, "he would not bother to stare at it." "Well, that's all I can tell you about the new religion," went on Flambeau carelessly. "It claims, of course, that it can cure all physical diseases." "Can it cure the one spiritual disease?" asked Father Brown, with a serious curiosity. "And what is the one spiritual disease?" asked Flambeau, smiling. "Oh, thinking one is quite well," said his friend. Flambeau was more interested in the quiet little office below him than in the flamboyant temple above. He was a lucid southerner, incapable of conceiving himself as anything but a Catholic or an atheist, and new religions of a bright and pallid sort were not much in his line. But humanity was always in his line, especially when it was good-looking. Moreover, the ladies downstairs were characters in their way. The office was kept by 2 sisters, both slight and dark, one of them tall and striking. She had a dark, eager, and aquiline profile, and was one of those women whom one always thinks of in profile as of the clean-cut edge of some weapon. She seemed to cleave her way through life. She had eyes of a startling brilliancy, but it was the brilliancy of steel rather than of diamonds, and her straight, slim figure was a shade too stiff for its grace. Her younger sister was like her short in shadow, a little grayer, paler, and more insignificant. They both wore a business-like black, with little masculine cuffs and collars. There are thousands of such curt, strenuous ladies in the offices of London, but the interest of these lay rather in their real than their apparent position. For Pauline Stacey, the elder, was actually the heiress of a crest and half a county, as well as great wealth. She had been brought up in castles and gardens, before a frigid fierceness peculiar to the modern woman had driven her to what she considered a harsher and a higher existence. She had not, indeed, surrendered her money. In that there would have been a romantic or monkish abandon quite alien to her masterful utilitarianism. She held her wealth, she would say, for use upon practical social objects. Part of it she had put into her business, the nucleus of a model typewriting emporium. Part of it was distributed in various leagues and causes for the advancement of such work among women. How far Joan, her sister and partner, shared this slightly prosaic idealism, no one could be very sure. But she followed her leader with a dog-like affection which was somehow more attractive, with its touch of tragedy, than the hard, high spirits of the elder. For Pauline Stacey had nothing to say to tragedy. She was understood to deny its existence. Her rigid rapidity and cold impatience had amused Flambeau very much on the first occasion of his entering the flats. He had lingered outside the lift and the entrance hall waiting for the lift boy, who generally conducts strangers to the various floors. But this bright-eyed falcon of a girl had openly refused to endure such official delay. She said sharply that she knew all about the lift, and was not dependent on boys, or men either. Though her flat was only 3 floors above, she managed in the few seconds of ascent to give Flambeau a great many of her fundamental views in an offhand manner. They were to the general effect that she was a modern working woman, and loved modern working machinery. Her bright black eyes blazed with abstract anger against those who rebuke mechanic science and ask for the return of romance. Everyone, she said, ought to be able to manage machines, just as she could manage the lift. She seemed almost to resent the fact of Flambeau opening the lift door for her, and that gentleman went up to his own apartment smiling with somewhat mingled feelings at the memory of such spitfire self-dependence. She certainly had a temper, of a snappy, practical sort. The gestures of her thin, elegant hands were abrupt or even destructive. Once Flambeau entered her office on some typewriting business and found she had just flung a pair of spectacles belonging to her sister into the middle of the floor and stamped on them. She was already in the rapids of an ethical tirade about the sickly medical notions and the morbid admission of weakness implied in such an apparatus. She dared her sister to bring such artificial, unhealthy rubbish into the place again. She asked if she was expected to wear wooden legs or false hair or glass eyes, and as she spoke her eyes sparkled like the terrible crystal. Flambeau, quite bewildered with his fanaticism, could not refrain from asking Miss Pauline, with direct French logic, why a pair of spectacles was a more morbid sign of weakness than a lift, and why, if science might help us in one effort, it might not help us in the other. "That is so different," said Pauline Stacey loftily. "Batteries and motors and all those things are marks of the force of man. Yes, Mr. Flambeau, and the force of woman, too. We shall take our turn at these great engines that devour distance and defy time. That is high and splendid. That is really science. But these nasty props and plasters the doctors sell, why, they are just badges of poltroonery. Doctors stick on legs and arms as if we were born cripples and sick slaves. But I was free-born, Mr. Flambeau. People only think they need these things because they have been trained in fear instead of being trained in power and courage, just as the silly nurses tell children not to stare at the sun, and so they can't do it without blinking. But why among the stars should there be one star that I may not see? The sun is not my master, and I will open my eyes and stare at him whenever I choose." "Your eyes," said Flambeau with a foreign bow, "will dazzle the sun." He took pleasure in complimenting this strange, stiff beauty, partly because it threw her a little off her balance. But as he went upstairs to his floor, he drew a deep breath and whistled, saying to himself, "So she has got into the hands of that conjurer upstairs with his golden eye." For, little as he knew or cared about the new religion of Kalon, he had heard of his special notion about sun-gazing. He soon discovered that the spiritual bond between the floors above and below him was close and increasing. The man who called himself Kalon was a magnificent creature, worthy, in a physical sense, to be pontiff of Apollo. He was nearly as tall even as Flambeau, and very much better looking, with a golden beard, strong blue eyes, and a mane flung back like a lion's. In structure, he was the blonde beast of Nietzsche, but all this animal beauty was heightened, brightened, and softened by genuine intellect and spirituality. If he looked like one of the great Saxon kings, he looked like one of the kings that were also saints. And this, despite the cockney incongruity of his surroundings, the fact that he had an office halfway up a building in Victoria Street, that the clerk, a commonplace youth in cuffs and collars, sat in the outer room between him and the corridor, that his name was on a brass plate, and the gilt emblem of his creed hung above his street like the advertisement of an oculist. All this vulgarity could not take away from the man called Kalon the vivid oppression and inspiration that came from his soul and body. When all was said, a man in the presence of this quack did feel in the presence of a great man. Even in the loose jacket suit of linen that he wore as a workshop dress in his office, he was a fascinating and formidable figure. And when robed in the white vestments and crowned with a golden circlet in which he daily saluted the sun, he really looked so splendid that the laughter of the street people sometimes died suddenly on their lips. For 3 times in the day the new sun worshipper went out on his little balcony, in the face of all Westminster, to say some litany to his shining Lord, once at daybreak, once at sunset, and once at the shock of noon. And it was while the shock of noon still shook faintly from the towers of Parliament and Parish Church that Father Brown, the friend of Flambeau, first looked up and saw the white priest of Apollo. Flambeau had seen quite enough of these daily salutations of Phoebus, and plunged into the porch of the tall building without even looking for his clerical friend to follow. But Father Brown, whether from a professional interest in ritual or a strong individual interest in tomfoolery, stopped and stared up at the balcony of the sun worshipper, just as he might have stopped and stared up at a Punch and Judy. Kalon the prophet was already erect, with argent garments and uplifted hands, and the sound of his strangely penetrating voice could be heard all the way down the busy street, uttering his solar litany. He was already in the middle of it. His eyes were fixed upon the flaming disk. It is doubtful if he saw anything or anyone on this earth. It is substantially certain that he did not see a stunted, round-faced priest who, in the crowd below, looked at him with blinking eyes. That was perhaps the most startling difference between even these two far-divided men. Father Brown could not look at anything without blinking, but the priest of Apollo could look on the blaze at noon without a quiver of the eyelid. "O sun," cried the prophet, "O star that art too great to be allowed among the stars, O fountain that flowest quietly in that secret spot that is called space, white father of all white unwearied things, white flames and white flowers and white peaks, Father, who art more innocent than all thy most innocent and quiet children, primal purity, into the peace of which a rush and crash like the reversed rush of a rocket was cloven with a strident and incessant yelling. 5 people rushed into the gate of the mansions as 3 people rushed out, and for an instant they all deafened each other. The sense of some utterly abrupt horror seemed for a moment to fill half the street with bad news that was all the worse because no one knew what it was. 2 figures remained still after the crash of commotion, the fair priest of Apollo on the balcony above, and the ugly priest of Christ below him. At last, the tall figure and titanic energy of Flambeau appeared in the doorway of the mansions and dominated the little mob. Talking at the top of his voice like a foghorn, he told somebody or anybody to go for a surgeon, and as he turned back into the dark and thronged entrance, his friend Father Brown dipped in insignificantly after him. Even as he ducked and dived through the crowd, he could still hear the magnificent melody and monotony of the solar priest still calling on the happy God who is the friend of fountains and flowers. Father Brown found Flambeau and some 6 other people standing round the enclosed space into which the lift commonly descended. But the lift had not descended. Something else had descended, something that ought to have come by a lift. For the last 4 minutes Flambeau had looked down on it, had seen the brained and bleeding figure of that beautiful woman who denied the existence of tragedy. He had never had the slightest doubt that it was Pauline Stacy, and though he had sent for a doctor, he had not the slightest doubt that she was dead. He could not remember for certain whether he had liked her or disliked her. There was so much both to like and dislike, but she had been a person to him, and the unbearable pathos of details and habit stabbed him with all the small daggers of bereavement. He remembered her pretty face and the priggish speeches with a sudden secret vividness which is all the bitterness of death. In an instant, like a bolt from the blue, like a thunderbolt from nowhere, that beautiful and defiant body had been dashed down the open well of the lift to death at the bottom. Was it suicide? With so insolent an optimist, it seemed impossible. Was it murder? But who was there in those hardly inhabited flats to murder anybody? In a rush of raucous words, which he meant to be strong and suddenly found weak, he asked where was that fellow Kalon. A voice, habitually heavy, quiet and full, assured him that Kalon, for the last 15 minutes, had been away up on his balcony worshipping his god. When Flambeau heard the voice and felt the hand of Father Brown, he turned his swarthy face and said abruptly, "Then if he has been up there all the time, who can have done it?" "Perhaps," said the other, "we might go upstairs and find out. We have half an hour before the police will move." Leaving the body of the slain heiress in charge of the surgeons, Flambeau dashed up the stairs to the typewriting office, found it utterly empty, and then dashed up to his own. Having entered that, he abruptly returned with a new and white face to his friend. "Her sister," he said, with an unpleasant seriousness, "her sister seems to have gone out for a walk." Father Brown nodded. "Or she may have gone up to the office of that Sun man," he said. "If I were you, I should just verify that, and Then let us all talk it over in your office. No," he added suddenly, as if remembering something. "Shall I ever get over that stupidity of mine?" "Of course, in their office downstairs." Flambeau stared, but he followed the little father downstairs to the empty flat of the Stacys, where that impenetrable pastor took a large red leather chair in the very entrance, from which he could not see the stairs and landings, and waited. He did not wait very long. In about 4 minutes 3 figures descended the stairs, alike only in their solemnity. The first was Joan Stacy, the sister of the dead woman. Evidently she had been upstairs in the temporary temple of Apollo. The second was the priest of Apollo himself, his litany finished, sweeping down the empty stairs in utter magnificence. Something in his white robes, beard, and parted hair had the look of Doors Christ leaving the praetorium. The third was Flambeau, black-browed and somewhat bewildered. Miss Joan Stacy, dark, with a drawn face and hair prematurely touched with gray, walked straight to her own desk and set out her papers with a practical flap. The mere action rallied everyone else to sanity. If Miss Joan Stacy was a criminal, she was a cool one. Father Brown regarded her for some time with an odd little smile, and then, without taking his eyes off her, addressed himself to somebody else. "Prophet," he said, presumably addressing Kalon, "I wish you would tell me a lot about your religion." "I shall be proud to do it," said Kalon, inclining his still-crowned head, "but I'm not sure that I understand." "Why, it's like this," said Father Brown in his frankly doubtful way. "We are taught that if a man has really bad first principles, that must be partly his fault. But for all that, we can make some difference between a man who insults his quite clear conscience and a man with a conscience more or less clouded with sophistries. Now, do you really think that murder is wrong at all?" "Is this an accusation?" asked Kalon very quietly. "No," answered Brown, equally gently. "It is the speech for the defense." In the long and startled stillness of the room, the prophet of Apollo slowly rose, and really it was like the rising of the sun. He filled that room with his light and life in such a manner that a man felt he could as easily have filled Salisbury Plain. His robed form seemed to hang the whole room with classic draperies. His epic gesture seemed to extend it into grander perspectives, till the little black figure of the modern cleric seemed to be a fault and an intrusion, a round black blot upon some splendor of Hellas. "We meet at last, Caiaphas," said the prophet. "Your church and mine are the only realities on this earth. I adore the sun, and you the darkening of the sun. You are the priest of the dying, and I of the living God. Your present work of suspicion and slander is worthy of your code and creed. All your church is but a black police. You are only spies and detectives seeking to tear from men confessions of guilt, whether by treachery or torture. You would convict men of crime, I would convict them of innocence. You would convince them of sin, I would convince them of virtue. Reader of the books of evil, one more word before I blow away your baseless nightmares forever. Not even faintly could you understand how little I care whether you could convict me or no. The things you call disgrace and horrible hanging are to me no more than an ogre in a child's toy book to a man once grown up. You said you were offering the speech for the defense. I care so little for the cloudland of this life that I will offer you the speech for the prosecution. There is but one thing that can be said against me in this matter, and I will say it myself. The woman that is dead was my love and my bride. Not after such manner as your tin chapels call lawful, but by a law purer and sterner than you will ever understand. She and I walked another world from yours, and trod palaces of crystal while you were plodding through tunnels and corridors of brick. Well, I know that policemen, theological and otherwise, always fancy that where there has been love, there must soon be hatred. So there you have the first point made for the prosecution. But the second point is stronger. I do not grudge it you. Not only is it true that Pauline loved me, but it is also true that this very morning, before she died, she wrote at that table a will leaving me and my new church $500,000. Come, where are the handcuffs? Do you suppose I care what foolish things you do with me? Penal servitude will only be like waiting for her at a wayside station. The gallows will only be going to her in a headlong car. He spoke with the brain-shaking authority of an orator. and Flambeau and Joan Stacy stared at him in amazed admiration. Father Brown's face seemed to express nothing but extreme distress. He looked at the ground with one wrinkle of pain across his forehead. The Prophet of the Sun leaned easily against the mantelpiece and resumed. In a few words, I have put before you the whole case against me, the only possible case against me. In fewer words still, I will blow it to pieces, so that not a trace of it remains. As to whether I have committed this crime, the truth is in one sentence. I could not have committed this crime. Pauline Stacy fell from this floor to the ground at 5 minutes past 12. 100 people will go into the witness box and say that I was standing out upon the balcony of my own rooms above from just before the stroke of noon to a quarter past, the usual period of my public prayers. My clerk, a respectable youth from Clapham, with no sort of connection with me, will swear that he sat in my outer office all the morning and that no communication passed through. He will swear that I arrived a full 10 minutes before the hour, 15 minutes before any whisper of the accident, and that I did not leave the office or the balcony all that time. No one ever had so complete an alibi. I could subpoena half Westminster. I think you had better put the handcuffs away again. The case is at an end. But last of all, that no breath of this idiotic suspicion remain in the air, I will tell you all you want to know. I believe I do know how my unhappy friend came by her death. You can, if you choose, blame me for it, or my faith and philosophy at least, but you certainly cannot lock me up. It is well known to all students of the higher truths that certain adepts and illuminati have in history attained the power of levitation, that is, of being self-sustained upon the empty air. It is but a part of that general conquest of matter which is the main element in our occult wisdom. Poor Pauline was of an impulsive and ambitious temper. I think, to tell the truth, she thought herself somewhat deeper in the mysteries than she was, and she has often said to me, as we went down in the lift together, that if one's will were strong enough, one could float down as harmlessly as a feather. I solemnly believe that in some ecstasy of noble thoughts she attempted the miracle. Her will or faith must have failed her at the crucial instant, and the lower law of matter had its horrible revenge. There is the whole story, gentlemen. Very sad, and, as you think, very presumptuous and wicked, but certainly not criminal or in any way connected with me. In the shorthand of the police courts, you had better call it suicide. I shall always call it heroic failure for the advance of science and the slow scaling of heaven. It was the first time Flambeau had ever seen Father Brown vanquished. He still sat looking at the ground with a painful and corrugated brow as if in shame. It was impossible to avoid the feeling which the prophet's winged words had fanned, that here was a sullen, professional suspector of men overwhelmed by a prouder and purer spirit of natural liberty and health. At last he said, blinking as if in bodily distress, "Well, if that is so, sir, you need to do no more than take the testamentary paper you spoke of and go. I wonder where the poor lady left it." "It will be over there on her desk by the door, I think," said Kalon, with that massive innocence of manner that seemed to acquit him wholly. "She told me specially she would write it this morning, and I actually saw her writing as I went up in the lift to my own room." "Was her door open then?" asked the priest, with his eye on the corner of the matting. "Yes," said Kalon calmly. "Ah, it has been open ever since," said the other, and resumed his silent study of the mat. "There is a paper over here," said the grim Miss Joan, in a somewhat singular voice. She had passed over to her sister's desk by the doorway, and was holding a sheet of blue foolscap in her hand. There was a sour smile on her face that seemed unfit for such a scene or occasion, and Flambeau looked at her with a darkening brow. Kalon the prophet stood away from the paper with that loyal unconsciousness that had carried him through. But Flambeau took it out of the lady's hand and read it with the utmost amazement. It did indeed begin in the formal manner of a will, but after the words, "I give and bequeath all of which I die possessed," the writing abruptly stopped with a set of scratches, and there was no trace of the name of any legatee. Flambeau, in wonder, handed this truncated testament to his clerical friend, who glanced at it and silently gave it to the priest of the sun. An instant afterwards, that pontiff and his splendid sweeping draperies had crossed the room in 2 great strides, and was towering over Joan Stacy, his blue eyes standing from his head. "What monkey tricks have you been playing here?" he cried. "That's not all Pauline wrote." They were startled to hear him speak in quite a new voice, with a Yankee shrillness in it. All his grandeur and good English had fallen from him like a cloak. "That is the only thing on her desk," said Joan, and confronted him steadily with the same smile of ill favor. Of a sudden the man broke out into blasphemies and cataracts of incredulous words. There was something shocking about the dropping of his mask. It was like a man's real face falling off. "See here," he cried in broad American, when he was breathless with cursing, "I may be an adventurer, but I guess you're a murderess. Yes, gentlemen, here's your death explained, and without any levitation. The poor girl is writing a will in my favor. Her cursed sister comes in, struggles for the pen, drags her to the well, and throws her down before she can finish it. Sakes, I reckon we want the handcuffs after all." "As you have truly remarked," replied Joan with ugly calm, "your clerk is a very respectable young man, who knows the nature of an oath, and he will swear in any court that I was up in your office arranging some typewriting work for 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after my sister fell. Mr. Flambeau will tell you that he found me there." There was a silence. "Why then," cried Flambeau, "Pauline was alone when she fell, and it was suicide." "She was alone when she fell," said Father Brown, "but it was not suicide." "Then how did she die?" asked Flambeau impatiently. "She was murdered." "But she was alone," objected the detective. "She was murdered when she was all alone," answered the priest. All the rest stared at him, but he remained sitting in the same old dejected attitude, with a wrinkle in his round forehead and an appearance of impersonal shame and sorrow. His voice was colorless and sad. "What I want to know," cried Kalon with an oath, "is when the police are coming for this bloody and wicked sister. She's killed her flesh and blood. She's robbed me of $500,000 that was just as sacredly mine as—" "Come, come, prophet," interrupted Flambeau with a kind of sneer. "Remember that all this world is a cloudland." The hierophant of the sun god made an effort to climb back on his pedestal. "It is not the mere money," he cried, "though that would equip the cause throughout the world. It is also my beloved one's wishes. To Pauline, all this was holy. In Pauline's eyes—" Father Brown suddenly sprang erect, so that his chair fell over flat behind him. He was deathly pale, and he seemed fired with a hope. His eyes shone. "That's it," he cried in a clear voice. "That's the way to begin. In Pauline's eyes." The tall prophet retreated before the tiny priest in an almost mad disorder. "What do you mean? How dare you?" he cried repeatedly. "In Pauline's eyes," repeated the priest, his own shining more and more. "Go on. In God's name, go on. The foulest crime the fiends ever prompted feels lighter after confession, and I implore you to confess. Go on. Go on. In Pauline's eyes—" "Let me go, you devil!" thundered Kalon, struggling like a giant in bonds. "Who are you, you cursed spy, to weave your spider's webs round me and peep and peer? Let me go!" "Shall I stop him?" asked Flambeau, bounding towards the exit, for Kalon had already thrown the door wide open. "No, let him pass," said Father Brown, with a strange deep sigh that seemed to come from the depths of the universe. "Let Cain pass by, for he belongs to God." There was a long-drawn silence in the room when he had left it, which was to Flambeau's fierce wits one long agony of interrogation. Miss Joan Stacy very coolly tidied up the papers on her desk. "Father," said Flambeau at last, "it is my duty, not my curiosity only, it is my duty to find out, if I can, who committed the crime." "Which crime?" asked Father Brown. "The one we are dealing with, of course," replied his impatient friend. "We are dealing with two crimes," said Brown, "crimes of very different weight, and by very different criminals." Miss Joan Stacy, having collected and put away her papers, proceeded to lock up her drawer. Father Brown went on, noticing her as little as she noticed him. "The two crimes," he observed, "were committed against the same weakness of the same person, in a struggle for her money. The author of the larger crime found himself thwarted by the smaller crime. The author of the smaller crime got the money." "Oh, don't go on like a lecturer," groaned Flambeau. "Put it in a few words." "I can put it in one word," answered his friend. Miss Joan Stacy skewered her business-like black hat onto her head with a business-like black frown before a little mirror, and, as the conversation proceeded, took her handbag and umbrella in an unhurried style and left the room. "The truth is one word, and a short one," said Father Brown. "Pauline Stacy was blind." "Blind!" repeated Flambeau, and rose slowly to his whole huge stature. "She was subject to it by blood," Brown proceeded. "Her sister would have started eyeglasses if Pauline would have let her. but it was her special philosophy or fad that one must not encourage such diseases by yielding to them. She would not admit the cloud, or she tried to dispel it by will. So her eyes got worse and worse with straining, but the worst strain was to come. It came with this precious prophet, or whatever he calls himself, who taught her to stare at the hot sun with the naked eye. It was called accepting Apollo. Oh, if these new pagans would only be old pagans, they would be a little wiser. The old pagans knew that mere naked nature worship must have a cruel side. They knew that the eye of Apollo can blast and blind. There was a pause, and the priest went on in a gentle and even broken voice. Whether or no that devil deliberately made her blind, there is no doubt that he deliberately killed her through her blindness. The very simplicity of the crime is sickening. You know he and she went up and down in those lifts without official help. You know also how smoothly and silently the lifts slide. Kalon brought the lift to the girl's landing and saw her, through the open door, writing in her slow, sightless way the will she had promised him. He called out to her cheerily that he had the lift ready for her, and she was to come out when she was ready. Then he pressed a button and shot soundlessly up to his own floor, walked through his own office, out onto his own balcony, and was safely praying before the crowded street when the poor girl, having finished her work, ran gaily out to where lover and lift were to receive her, and stepped— "Don't!" cried Flambeau. "He ought to have got $500,000 by pressing that button," continued the little father, in the colorless voice in which he talked of such horrors. "But that went smash. It went smash because there happened to be another person who also wanted the money, and who also knew the secret about poor Pauline's sight. There was one thing about that will which I think nobody noticed. Although it was unfinished and without signature, the other Miss Stacy and some servant of hers had already signed it as witnesses. Joan had signed first, saying Pauline could finish it later, with a typical feminine contempt for legal forms. Therefore, Joan wanted her sister to sign the will without real witnesses. Why? I thought of the blindness, and felt sure she had wanted Pauline to sign in solitude because she had not wanted her to sign at all. People like the Stacys always use fountain pens, but this was specially natural to Pauline. By habit and her strong will and memory, she could still write almost as well as if she saw, but she could not tell when her pen needed dipping. Therefore, her fountain pens were carefully filled by her sister, all except this fountain pen. This was carefully not filled by her sister. The remains of the ink held out for a few lines, and then failed altogether. And the prophet lost £500,000, and committed one of the most brutal and brilliant murders in human history for nothing. Flambeau went to the open door and heard the official police ascending the stairs. He turned and said, "You must have followed everything devilish close to have traced the crime to Kalon in 10 minutes. Father Brown gave a sort of start. "Oh, to him," he said. "No, I had to follow rather close to find out about Miss Joan and the fountain pen, but I knew Kalon was the criminal before I came into the front door." "You must be joking," cried Flambeau. "I'm quite serious," answered the priest. "I tell you I knew he had done it even before I knew what he had done." "But why?" "These pagan Stoics," said Father Brown reflectively, "always fail by their strength. There came a crash and a scream down the street, and the priest of Apollo did not start or look around. I did not know what it was, but I knew that he was expecting it." End of The Eye of Apollo by G.K. Chesterton.
The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennine, not less, in fact, than in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearance it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls not only in their main surfaces, but in very many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary, in these paintings my incipient delirium perhaps had caused me to take deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately to the contemplation of these pictures and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe them. Long, long I read, and devoutly, devotedly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty, rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But the action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within a niche of the room which had hitherto been thrown into deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly, and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent even to my own perception. But while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for so shutting them. It was an impulsive movement to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments I again looked fixedly at the painting. That I now saw aright I could not and would not doubt, for the first flashing of the candles upon that canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses, and to startle me at once into waking life. The portrait, I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of the favourite heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded and filigreed in Moresque. As a thing of art nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself, but it could have been neither the execution of the work nor the immortal beauty of the countenance which had so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. Least of all could it have been that my fancy, shaken from its half slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design of the vignetting and of the frame must have instantly dispelled such idea, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute life-likeliness of expression, which at first startlingly, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe I replaced the candelabrum in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from my view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow: She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art; she a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber, where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour, and from day to day; and he was a passionate and wild and moody man, who became lost in reveries, so that he would not see that the light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret withered the health and the spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on, and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and turned his eyes from canvas merely, even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and but little remained to do, save one brush upon the mouth and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp. And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. But in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid, and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. End of the Oval Portrait. Recording by Ralph Snelson, Springfield, Utah. The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. For the most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburthen my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me they have presented little but horror, and to many they will seem less terrible than barroques. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace, some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black, and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had I blushed to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol? And at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when in his fright at my violence he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fibre of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse, for the crime of which I had been guilty; but it was at best a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all the memory of the deed. In the meantime the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account, yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties, or sentiments, which give direction to the character of man. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cool blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse at my heart, hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense, hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts, and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here in great measure resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager attention. The words "strange," "singular," and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme. But at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by some one of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented for another pet of the same species, and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. One night, as I sat half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin or of rum which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite, splotch of white covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it of the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not for some weeks strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence, as from the breath of a pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery, on the morning after I brought it home, that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinency which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair, or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet, and thus nearly throw me down, or fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees, degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this above all I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. O mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death! And now was I indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me a man, fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which of course would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp, and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box as if merchandise, with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up, and made to resemble the red of the cellar. I make no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution. I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly, and said to myself, "Here at least, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at the moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate; but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep, the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came, very unexpectedly, into the house, and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook nor corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom, and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say, if but one word, by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health, and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well constructed house." In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. "I may say an excellently well constructed house. These walls— Are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together." And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch fiend! No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into the silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in the damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. End of The Black Cat. Recording by Ralph Snelson.
The Mysterious Mummy by Sax Rohmer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysterious Mummy by Sax Rohmer. It was about 5 o'clock on a hot August afternoon that a tall, thin man, wearing a weedy beard and made conspicuous by an ill-fitting frock coat and an almost napless silk hat, walked into the entrance hall of the great Portland Square Museum. He carried no stick, and looking about him as though unfamiliar with the building, he ultimately mounted the principal staircase, walking with a pronounced stoop, and at intervals coughing with a hollow sound. His gaunt figure attracted the attention of several people, among them the attendant in the Egyptian room. Hardened though he was to the eccentric inhumanity, the man who hung so eagerly over the mummies of departed kings and coughed so frequently, nevertheless secured his instant attention. Visitors of the regulation type were rapidly thinning out, so that the gaunt man, during the whole of the time he remained in the room, was kept under close surveillance by the vigilant official. Seeing him go in the direction of the stairs, the attendant supposed the strange visitor to be about to leave the museum. But that he did not do so immediately was shown by subsequent testimony. The day's business being concluded, the staff of police who patrol nightly the great square museum duly filed into the building. A man is placed in each room, it being his duty to examine thoroughly every nook and cranny, having done which, all doors of communication are closed, the officer on guard in one room being unable to leave his post or to enter another. Every hour the inspector, a sergeant, and a fireman make a round of the entire building, from which it will be seen that a person having designs on any of the numerous treasures of the place would require more than average ingenuity to bring his plans to a successful issue. In recording this very singular case, the only incident of the night to demand attention is that of the mummy in the Etruscan room. Persons familiar with the great Portland Square Museum will know that certain of the tombs in the Etruscan room are used as receptacles for Egyptian mummies that have, for various reasons, never been put upon exhibition. Anyone who has peered under the partially raised lid of a huge sarcophagus and found within the rigid form of a mummy will appreciate the feelings of the man on night duty amid surroundings so lugubrious. The electric light, it should be mentioned, is not extinguished until the various apartments have been examined, and its extinction immediately precedes the locking of the door. The constable in the Etruscan room glanced into the various sarcophagi and cast the rays of his bull's-eye lantern into the shadows of the great stone tombs. Satisfied that no one lurked there, he mounted the steps leading up to the Roman gallery, turning out the lights in the room below from the switch at the top. The light was still burning on the ground floor, and the sergeant had not yet arrived with the keys. It was whilst the man stood awaiting his coming that a singular thing occurred. From somewhere within the darkened chamber beneath there came the sound of a hollow cough. By no means deficient in courage, the constable went down the step in 3 bounds, his lantern throwing discs of light upon stately statues and gloomy tombs. The sound was not repeated, and having nothing to guide him to its source, he commenced a second methodical search of the sarcophagi, as offering the most likely hiding places. When all save one had been examined, the constable began to believe that the coughing had existed only in his imagination. It was upon casting the rays of his bull's eye into the last sarcophagus that he experienced a sudden sensation of fear. It was empty, yet he distinctly remembered from his previous examination that a mummy had lain there. At the moment of making this weird discovery, he realized that he would have done better, before commencing his search for the man with the cough, first to turn on the light, for it must be remembered that he had extinguished the electric lamps. Determined to do so before pursuing his investigations further, he ran up the steps to find the Roman gallery in darkness. The bright disk of a lantern was approaching from the upper end, and the man ran forward. "Who turned off the lights here?" came the voice of the sergeant. "That's what I want to know. Someone did it while I was downstairs," said the constable, and gave a hurried account of the mysterious coughing and the missing mummy. "How long has there been a mummy in this tomb?" asked the sergeant. "There was one there a month back, but they took it upstairs. They may have brought it down again last week, though, or it may have been a fresh one. You see, the other lot were on duty up to last night." This was quite true, as the sergeant was aware. 3 bodies of picked men share the night duties at the great Portland Square Museum, and those on duty upon this particular occasion had not been in the place during the previous 2 weeks. "Very strange," muttered the sergeant, and a moment later his whistle was sounding. From all over the building men came running, for none of the doors had yet been locked. "There seems to be someone concealed in the museum. Search all the rooms again," was the brief order. The constables disappeared, and the sergeant, accompanied by the inspector, went down to examine the Etruscan room. Nothing was found there, nor were any of the other searchers more successful. There was no trace anywhere of a man in hiding. Beyond leaving open the door between the Roman gallery and the steps of the Etruscan room, no more could be done in the matter. The gallery communicates with the entrance hall, where the inspector, together with the sergeant and fireman, spends the night, and the idea of the former was to keep in touch with the scene of these singular happenings. His action was perfectly natural, but these precautions were subsequently proved to be absolutely useless. The night passed without any disturbing event, and the mystery of the vanishing mummy and the ghostly cough seemed likely to remain a mystery. The night police filed out in the early morning, and the inspector, with the sergeant, returned as soon as possible to the museum to make further inquiries concerning the missing occupant of the sarcophagus. "A mummy in the inn tomb!" exclaimed the curator of Etruscan antiquities. "My dear sir, there has been no mummy in there for nearly a month." "But my man states that he saw one there last night," declared the inspector. The curator looked puzzled. Turning to an attendant, he said, "Who was in charge of the Etruscan room immediately before 6 last night?" "I was, sir." "Were there any visitors?" "No one came in between 5:40 and 6. And before that?" "I was away at tea, sir." "Who was in charge then?" "Mr. Robbins." "Call Robbins." The commissionaire in question arrived. "How long were you in the Etruscan room last night?" "About half an hour, sir." "Are you sure that no one concealed himself?" The man looked startled. "Well, sir," he said hesitatingly, "I'm sorry I didn't report it before, but when Mr. Barton called me at about 25 minutes to 6, there was someone in there, a gent in a seedy frock coat and a high hat, and I don't remember seeing him come out." "Did you search the room?" "Yes, sir, but there was no one to be seen." "You should have reported the matter at once. I must see Barton." Barton, the head attendant, remembered speaking to Robbins at the top of the stairs leading to the Etruscan room. He saw no one come out, but it was just as possible for a person to have done so and yet be seen by neither himself or Robins. "Let 3 of you thoroughly overhaul the room for any sign of a man having hidden there," directed the curator briskly. He turned to the sergeant and inspector with a smile. "I rather fancy it will prove to be a mare's nest," he said. "We've had these mysteries before." The words had but just left his lips when a museum official, a well-known antiquarian expert, ran up in a perfect frenzy of excitement. "Good heavens, Peters!" he gasped. "The Rienzi vase has gone!" "What?" came an incredulous chorus. "The circular top of the case has been completely cut out and ingeniously replaced, and a plausible imitation of the vase substituted." They waited for no more, but hurried upstairs to the vase room, which in the great Portland Square Museum is really only a part of the Egyptian room. The Rienzi vase, though no larger than an ordinary breakfast cup, all the world knows to be of fabulous value. It seemed inconceivable that anyone could have stolen it. Yet there, in the midst of a knot of excited officials, stood the empty case, whilst the imitation antique was being passed from hand to hand. Never before nor since has such a scene been witnessed in the museum. The staff, to a man, had lost their wits. "What is to be done?" was the general inquiry. In less than half an hour the doors would have to be opened to the public, and the absence of the famous vase would inevitably be noticed. It was at this juncture, and whilst everyone was speaking at once, that one of the party, standing close to a wall cabinet, suddenly held up a warning finger. "Hush!" he said. "Listen!" A sudden silence fell upon the room, so that people running about in other apartments could be plainly heard. And presently, from somewhere behind the glass doors surrounding the place, came a low moan, electrifying the already excited listeners. The keys were promptly forthcoming, and then was made the second astounding discovery of the eventful morning. A man, gagged and bound, was imprisoned behind a great mummy case. Eager hands set to work to release him, and restoratives were applied, as he seemed to be in a very weak condition. He was but partially dressed, and breathed heavily through his nose, like a man in a drunken slumber. All waited breathlessly for his return to consciousness, for certainly he, if anyone, should be in a position to furnish some clue to the deep mystery. On regaining his senses, he had disappointingly little to tell. He was Constable Smith, who had been on night duty in the Egyptian room. Sometime during the first hour, and not long after the alarm in the basement, he had been mysteriously pinioned as he paraded the apartment. He caught no glimpse of his opponent, who held him from behind in such a manner that he was totally unable to defend himself. Some sweet-smelling drug had been applied to his nostrils, and he remembered no more until regaining consciousness in the mummy case. That was the whole of his testimony. In setting out the particulars of this remarkable affair, a third and final discovery must be noted. The 3 men who had been directed to examine the Etruscan room brought to light a bundle of old garments, containing an ancient opera hat, a faded frock coat, a pair of shiny trousers, and a pair of elastic-sided boots. They were wedged high up at the back of a tall statue, where they had evidently escaped the eyes of all previous searchers. That constituted the entire data upon which investigations had to be based. The Egyptian room was closed indefinitely, for repairs. No further useful evidence could be obtained from anyone. Several witnesses furnished consistent descriptions of the shabby stranger with the hollow cough, but it may here be mentioned that no one of them ever set eyes upon him again. The inspector, the sergeant, and the fireman solemnly swore to have visited the Egyptian room at the end of each hour throughout the night, and to having found the constable on duty as usual. Smith swore with equal solemnity that he had been drugged during the first hour and subsequently confined in the mummy case. The matter was carefully kept out of the papers, although the museum, throughout many following days, positively bristled with detectives. As the second week drew to a close and the Egyptian room still remained locked, well-informed persons began to whisper that a scandal could no longer be avoided. There can be no doubt that in many quarters Constable Smith's share in the proceedings was regarded with grave suspicion. It was at this critical juncture, when it seemed inevitable that the loss of the world-famous Rienzi vase must be made known to an unsympathetic public, that certain high authorities gave out that the vase had been removed, and that none of the night staff were in any way implicated in its disappearance. On this announcement being made, several strange theories were mooted. Some stated that the vase had never left the museum. Others averred that it had been pawned to a foreign government. Whatever the real explanation, and the secret was jealously guarded by the high-placed officials who alone knew the truth, suffice it that the Egyptian room was again thrown open and the Rienzi vase shown to be reposing in its usual position. Now that it again stands in its place for all to see, there can be no objection to my relating how I once held the famous Rienzi vase in my possession for 12 days. If there be any objection, I am sorry. You must understand I am no common thief, no footpad. I am a person of keenly observant character, and my business is to detect vital weaknesses in great institutions and to charge a moderately high fee for my services. Thus I discovered that a certain famous tiara in a French museum was inadequately protected, and accordingly removed it, replacing it by a substitute. The authorities refused me my fee, and all the world knows that my clever forgery was detected by the experts. That brought them to their senses. It is the genuine tiara that reposes in their cabinet now. In the same way I removed a world-renowned historical mummy from its resting place in Cairo, and 2 days later they grew suspicious of my imitation. It was the handiwork of a clever Birmingham artist, and the department was closed. The bulky character of the mummy nearly brought about my downfall, and it was only by abandoning it that I succeeded in leaving Cairo. I'm not proud of that case. I was clumsy. But of the case of the Rienzi vase I have every reason to be highly proud. That you may judge of the neatness and dispatch with which I acted, I will relate how the whole business was conducted. You must know, then, that the first flaw I discovered in the arrangements at the great Portland Square Museum was this: the wall cases were badly guarded. I learnt this interesting fact one afternoon as I strolled about the Egyptian room. A certain gentleman, I will not name him, was showing a party of the ladies round the apartment. He had unlocked a wall case and was standing with a handsome bead necklet in his hand, explaining where and when it was found. He was only a few yards away, but with his back toward the case. Enough. The key, with others attached, was in the glass door. You will admit that this was exceedingly careless, but the presence of 4 charming American ladies, one can excuse him. I regret to have to confess that I was somewhat awkward. The keys rattled. The whole party looked in my direction, but the immaculate man about town, with his cultivated manner and his very considerable knowledge of Egyptology, how should they suspect? I apologized. I had brushed against them in passing. I made myself agreeable, and the uncomfortable incident was forgotten. By them, not by me. I had a beautiful wax impression to keep my memory fresh. The scheme formed then. I knew that a body of picked police promenaded the museum at night, and that each of the rooms was usually in charge of the same man. I learnt later that there were 3 bodies of men, so that the same police were in the museum but 1 week in every 3. I made the acquaintance of 7 constables and frequented 8 different public houses before I met the man of whom I was in search. The first policeman I found, who paraded the Egyptian room at night, was short and thick-set. I gave him up as a bad job. I learned from him, however, who was to occupy the post during the coming week, and presently I unearthed the private bar which this latter officer, his name was Smith, used. Eureka! He was tall and thin. Incidentally, he was also surly, but the winning ways of the jovial master plumber, who was so free with his money, ultimately thawed him. Every night throughout the rest of the week I spent in this constable's company, studying his somewhat colorless personality. Then one afternoon I entered the museum. My weedy beard, my gaunt expression, my hollow cough, they were all in the part. I went up to the Egyptian room to assure myself that a certain mummy case had not been removed, and having found it to occupy its usual place, I descended to the Etruscan basement. For half an hour I occupied myself there, but the commissionaire never budged from his seat. I knew that this particular man was only in temporary charge, whilst another was at tea, for I was well posted, and wondered if his companion were ever coming back. Luckily, an incident occurred to serve my purpose. The chief attendant appeared at the head of the steps. "Robbins," he called. Robbins ran briskly upstairs at his command, and then, in 15 seconds, my transformation was complete. Gone were the weedy gray beard and mustache. Gone the seedy black garments and the elastic-sided boots. Gone the old opera hat, and behold, I was Constable Smith, attired in mummy wrappings. An acrobatic spring, and the bundle of aged garments was wedged behind a tall statue where nothing but a most minute search could reveal it. Down again, not a second to spare. Into the empty sarcophagus at the further end of the room, and lastly, a hideous rubber mask slipped over the ruddy features of Constable Smith and attached behind the ears. My arms stiffened, and my hands concealed in the wrappings, and I was a long-dead mummy, with a neat leather case hidden beneath my arched back. Brisk work, I assure you, but one grows accustomed to it in time. The commissionaire entered the room very shortly afterwards. He had not seen me go out, but, as I expected, neither was he absolutely sure I had not done so. He peered about suspiciously, but I did not mind. The real ordeal came a couple of hours later, when a police officer flashed his lantern into all the tombs. For a moment my heart seemed to cease beating as the light shone on my rubber countenance, but he was satisfied, this stupid policeman, and I heard his footsteps retreating to the door. I allowed him time to get to the top and extinguished the light in the Etruscan room, and then I was out of my tomb and hidden in the little niche immediately beside the foot of the stairs. I coughed loudly. Heavens! He came back down the steps with such velocity he was carried halfway along the room. He began to flash his lantern into the tombs again, but before he had examined the first of them I was upstairs in the Roman gallery. Without the electric light it was quite dark in the Etruscan room, which is in the basement, but being a bright night I knew I could find what I required in the Roman gallery without the aid of artificial light. Besides, I had not to act in the open. Someone might arrive too soon. So, thoroughly well posted as to the situation of the switches, I extinguished the lamps and dodged in among the Roman stonework to the foot of a great pillar, towering almost to the lofty roof and surmounted by an ornate capital. I had planned all this beforehand, you see, but I must confess it was an awful scramble to the top. I had only just curled up on the summit, the hand of my invaluable leather case held fast in my teeth, when a sergeant came running down the gallery almost into the arms of the constable who was running up the steps from the Etruscan room. A moment's hurried conversation, then the lights turned on, and the sound of a whistle. It was foolish, of course, but I had expected it. From all over the building, the police arrived, and fatigued as I was with my climb, yet another acrobatic feat was before me. The top of my pillar was no great distance from the stone balustrade of the first floor landing, on which the Egyptian room opens, and a narrow ledge, perhaps of 11 inches, runs all round the wall of the Roman gallery, some 4 feet below the ceiling. I cautiously stepped from the pillar to the ledge. I was invisible from the other end of the place, and pressing my body close against the wall, reached the balustrade. Before Constable Smith, who had left his post and descended to the lower gallery on hearing the sergeant's whistle, re-entered the Egyptian room, my bright new key had found the lock of a certain cabinet, and I was secure behind a mummy case, whilst a little steel pin prevented the spring of the lock from shutting me in. Poor Constable Smith. I was sorry to have to act so, but 10 minutes after the closing of the doors of communication, I came on him from behind, having silently crept from the case as he passed me, and following him down the darkened room, the thin linen wrappings that covered my feet making no sound upon the wooden floor. I had a pad ready in my hand, saturated with the contents of a small phial that had reposed in my mummy garments. I thrust my knee in his spine, seized his hands by a trick which you may learn for a peseta any day in the purlieus of Tangier. A muscular man, he tried hard to cope with his unseen opponent, but the pad never left his mouth and nostrils, and the few muffled cries that escaped him were luckily unheard. He soon became conscious, and I had to work hard lest the inspector should make his round before I was ready for him. The mummy case had to be lowered onto the floor, and the heavy body tightly bound and lifted into it, then stood up again and securely locked behind the glass doors. It was hot work, and I had but just accomplished the task and climbed into the constable's uniform when the inspector's key sounded in the door. Ah, it is an exciting profession. The rest was easy. Wrapped up in my yellow mummy linen were the various appliances required, and in the leather box was the imitation Rienzi vase. The circular glass top of the case gave some trouble. So hard and thick was it I had to desist 5 times and conceal my tools, owing to the hourly visits of the inspector. Poor Constable Smith began to groan towards 6 o'clock, and a second dose of medicine was necessary to keep him quiet for another hour or so. I filed out with the other policemen in the morning, the Rienzi vase inside my helmet. As to the sequel, it is brief. Of course the detectives tried their hands at the affair, but pooh, I'm too old a bird to leave clues. It's only amateurs that do that. My fee, and the conditions to be observed in paying it, I conveyed to the authorities privately. They thought they had a clue then, and delayed another week. They actually detained my unhappy agent, a most guileless and upright person who knew positively nothing. Oh, it was too funny. But realizing that only by the vase being returned to its place could a scandal be avoided, they met me in the matter. End of The Mysterious Mummy. The Thinking Machine by Jacques Futrelle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Thinking Machine by Jacques Futrelle. It was absolutely impossible. 25 chess masters from the world at large, foregathered in Boston for the annual championships, unanimously declared it impossible. And unanimity on any given point is an unusual mental condition for chess masters. Not one would concede for an instant that it was within the range of human achievement. Some grew red in the face as they argued it, others smiled loftily and were silent, still others dismissed the matter in a word as wholly absurd. A casual remark by the distinguished scientist and logician, Professor Augustus S. F. X. Van Dusen, provoked the discussion. He had in the past aroused bitter disputes by some chance remark. In fact, had been once a sort of controversial center of the sciences. It had been due to his modest announcement of a startling and unorthodox hypothesis that he had been invited to vacate the chair of philosophy in a great university. Later, that university had felt honored when he accepted its degree of LL.D. For a score of years, educational and scientific institutions of the world had amused themselves by crowding degrees upon him. He had initials that stood for things he couldn't pronounce. Degrees from France, England, Russia, Germany, Italy, Sweden, and Spain. These were expressed recognition of the fact that his was the foremost brain in the sciences. The imprint of his crabbed personality lay heavily on half a dozen of its branches. Finally, there came a time when argument was respectfully silent in the face of one of his conclusions. The remark which had arrayed the chess masters of the world into so formidable and unanimous a dissent was made by Professor Van Dusen in the presence of three other gentlemen of note. One of these, Dr. Charles Elbert, happened to be a chess enthusiast. Chess is a shameless perversion of the functions of the brain, was Professor Van Dusen's declaration in his perpetually irritated voice. It is a sheer waste of effort, greater because it is possibly the most difficult of all fixed abstract problems. Of course logic will solve it. Logic will solve any problem. Not most of them, but any problem. A thorough understanding of its rules would enable anyone to defeat your greatest chess players. It would be inevitable, just as inevitable as that 2 and 2 make 4, not sometimes, but all the time. I don't know chess because I never do useless things, but I could take a few hours of competent instruction and defeat a man who has devoted his life to it. His mind is cramped, bound down to the logic of chess. Mine is not. Mine employs logic in its widest scope. Dr. Elbert shook his head vigorously. "It is impossible," he asserted. "Nothing is impossible," snapped the scientist. "The human mind can do anything. It is all we have to lift us above the brute creation. For heaven's sake, leave us that." The aggressive tone, the uncompromising egotism, brought a flush to Dr. Elbert's face. Professor Van Dusen affected many persons that way, particularly those fellow savants who, themselves men of distinction, had ideas of their own. "Do you know the purposes of chess, its countless combinations?" asked Dr. Elbert. "No," was the crabbed reply. "I know nothing whatever of the game beyond the general purpose, which I understand to be to move certain pieces in certain directions to stop an opponent from moving his king. Is that correct?" "Yes," said Dr. Albert slowly, "but I never heard it stated just that way before." "Then, if that is correct, I maintain that the true logician can defeat the chess expert by the pure mechanical rules of logic. I'll take a few hours sometime, acquaint myself with the moves of the pieces, and defeat you to convince you." Professor Van Dusen glared savagely into the eyes of Dr. Albert. "Not me," said Dr. Albert. "You say anyone. You, for instance, might defeat the greatest chess player. Would you be willing to meet the greatest chess player after you acquaint yourself with the game?" "Certainly," said the scientist. "I have frequently found it necessary to make a fool of myself to convince people. I'll do it again." This, then, was the acrimonious beginning of the discussion, which aroused chess masters and brought open dissent from eminent men who had not dared for years to dispute any assertion by the distinguished Professor Van Dusen. It was arranged that at the conclusion of the championships, Professor Van Dusen should meet the winner. This happened to be Tchaikovsky, the Russian, who had been champion for half a dozen years. After this expected result of the tournament, Hillsbury, a noted American master, spent a morning with Professor Van Dusen in the latter's modest apartments on Beacon Hill. He left there with a sadly puzzled face. That afternoon, Professor Van Dusen met the Russian champion. The newspapers had said a great deal about the affair, and hundreds were present to witness the game. There was a little murmur of astonishment when Professor Van Dusen appeared. He was slight, almost childlike in body, and his thin shoulders seemed to droop beneath the weight of his enormous head. He wore a number 8 hat. His brow rose straight and dome-like, and a heavy shock of long yellow hair gave him almost a grotesque appearance. The eyes were narrow slits of blue, squinting eternally through thick spectacles. The face was small, clean-shaven, drawn, and white with the pallor of the student. His lips made a perfectly straight line. His hands were remarkable for their whiteness, their flexibility, and for the length of the slender fingers. One glance showed that physical development had never entered into the schedule of the scientist's 50 years of life. The Russian smiled as he sat down at the chess table. He felt that he was humoring a crank. The other masters were grouped nearby, curiously expectant. Professor Van Dusen began the game, opening with a queen's gambit. At his 5th move, made without the slightest hesitation, the smile left the Russian's face. At the 10th, the masters grew intensely eager. The Russian champion was playing for honor now. Professor Van Dusen's 14th move was King's Castle to Queen's 4. Check, he announced. After a long study of the board, the Russian protected his king with a knight. Professor Van Dusen noted the play, then leaned back in his chair with fingertips pressed together. His eyes left the board and dreamily studied the ceiling. For at least 10 minutes there was no sound, no movement. Then, "Mate in 15 moves," he said quietly. There was a quick gasp of astonishment. It took the practiced eyes of the masters several minutes to verify the announcement, but the Russian champion saw and leaned back in his chair, a little white and dazed. He was not astonished. He was helplessly floundering in a maze of incomprehensible things. Suddenly, he arose and grasped the slender hand of his conqueror. "You have never played chess before?" he asked. "Never." "Mon Dieu, you are not a man. You are a brain. A machine. A thinking machine." "It's a child's game," said the scientist abruptly. There was no note of exultation in his voice. It was still the irritable, impersonal tone which was habitual. This, then, was Professor Augustus S. F. X. Van Dusen, Ph.D., LL.D., F.R.S., M.D., etc., etc., etc. This is how he came to be known to the world at large as the thinking machine. The Russian's phrase had been applied to the scientist as a title by a newspaper reporter, Hutchison Hatch. It had stuck. End of The Thinking Machine.